Welcome to the Climate School's signature speaker series. And we've been a bit quiet for a little while. I've been doing other things, but we've got some fantastic speakers over the next few weeks. The first of which, to excite you, is this evening's speaker, James Mwangi. So I'm not going to say too much in the way of introduction, but James is the founder of the Climate Action Platform in Africa, which he launched for Africa, which he helped launched to help unlock Africa's potential to transform economies while playing a leading role in effective climate action. Prior to that, he spent 20 years at the Dalberg Group, which he helped found, leading the firm's expansion into Africa in 2007, and serving as global managing partner of Dalberg Advisors, and most recently as executive director of the Dalberg Group. During his tenure, James led the growth, incubation, or acquisition of many of the entities that today constitute Dalberg's operational footprint in over 25 countries on 6 continents. James also serves as an independent director on several boards, including the Skoll Foundation, the Global Center for Pluralism, One Acre Fund, Old Mutual Limited, and Cocoa Networks. James is a 2009 Archbishop Tutu Leadership Fellow of the African Leadership Institute, a 2013 Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum. Leader of the World sounds better, actually, doesn't it? We'll do that next. And a 2021 Yale World Fellow. He holds an honors degree in economics from Harvard University. So please welcome James Mwangi, who's going to talk to us about unleashing the green giant, Africa's potential for transformation through climate action. And we'll have questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Halliday, for that kind introduction and kind welcome. And thank you to you all for coming to this session. I'm looking at this crowd and I'm feeling very nervous because I'm at a school that's focused on climate. I'm a relatively new convert into this world, and I'm looking at a lot of experts, including people whose fields I'll be making reference to. So bear with me, but hopefully we can have a good conversation about the ways in which Africa could perhaps play a different role in the climate narrative than the one we're used to. All right. That's not it. All right. Okay, we're done. All right. Let's... Anyone else read that really cheerful IPCC report yesterday? All right, great. So, unleashing a green giant, Africa's potential for economic transformation through climate action. And I can see that the fonts did not carry over, so a lot of the slides will look weird, but that's hopefully okay. We can we can power through. So the first thing to note is we are in this strange moment, right? The latest submission from the IPCC yesterday was sobering reading. But buried in there were some interesting observations. One was this quote that basically underlines the fact by the chair, that basically underlines the fact that increasingly, unlike even a few years ago, a lot of the potential solutions we're going to need to scale are known to us. The resources we are lacking are primarily political will. At the same time, a somewhat more optimistic take from a few years ago from Mark Carney is, I think, being proven increasingly true, which is embedded in some of these new solutions are some of the most incredible and exciting commercial opportunities that this century will have to offer. And that was my entry point into this. As you may have heard from Dean Halliday's introduction, I have not studied climate in any meaningful way, and no one would mistake my career until a few years ago for that of a climate action activist. However, I did spend much of my career focused on jobs. Specifically, when I was working with clients, most of my work was focused on a very simple question. How do we take Africa's youth bulge the largest demographic surge in human history that will take Africa's population to 2.5 billion by 2050 and turn that from a potential disaster into an actual transformative benefit for the planet. And after years of looking at everything from the potential of digital jobs, the potential for smallholder improving income of smallholder farmers, improving women's access to employment and credit, name the lever, creative industries, and so on, I came to a very sobering realization. There was just a limit to how far Africa could go towards creating dignified livelihoods for its young people for fundamental structural reasons. The most fundamental of which is Africa today, most of Africa's economies are, for reasons at times beyond their control, not competitive in value addition industries. Almost without exception, African countries are exporters of bulk raw commodities. You go to the port of Mombasa in Kenya, where I'm from, and you see all the ships going out with unprocessed stuff, and you see other ships coming back in with high value added manufactured goods for the country. Now, it's possible to get out of poverty exporting raw materials if you have a low population relative to your raw material endowment. But if you have a large and growing population, forget about it, because no matter what you do, you're always importing things that are more valuable than the stuff you sent out to cover the increasing expectations of improved living standards. So that becomes a Red Queen's race, and you look at every African country and you see them all running on that treadmill because the labor price arbitrage opportunity that Asia was able to ride into middle income status and becoming the world's factory is not available to Africa, in part because the Asia hasn't yet completely used up its productive labor headroom. And in addition, thanks to things like, they call it the zip code premium, I prefer to call it what it is, the prejudice premium. Cost of capital in Africa is high. So building the capital endowments that entrepreneurs need in order to build competitive industry just is harder than it is anywhere else, even after you take into account any real estimations of local risk. So I'm looking at this picture and saying, wait a second, we're going to need 30 million new jobs per year. All of the incremental ways we are looking at ways to tighten African economy's job creation potential aren't working. What will it take? And the answer I came to, or the hypothesis I came to 3 years ago, was you need something that's going to shake up the world somehow. Something has to change, not just conditions and market relationships in Africa, but between Africa and the rest of the world. It's as much about what's happening in the EU, in the US, in Asia, as it is anything that could be affected in Nairobi or Arusha or Johannesburg. And that's what brought me to climate. Now, this is the typical way that people think about climate change and Africa. Point number one, Africa is a big victim of climate change, right? We now know that 1.5 is going to be in the rearview mirror in all likelihood, or rather we are accepting it. That will mean about a 5% GDP loss per year by 2030, if that is indeed where we're heading. We're already seeing the drag on GDP. Kenya is in the middle of an unprecedented drought that has been a continuous drag on top of COVID on the country's economy. Secondly, the loss and damage conversation. So the first point is everyone who's emitting and has gotten rich and comfortable through emitting, please, please, please stop. You hear African leaders saying that. Please stop doing what you're doing. It's hurting us. Secondly, it's hurting us in ways that we cannot afford to protect ourselves against. We are suffering loss and damage that we simply don't have the resources to kind of compensate for. That was COP27 in Egypt, was all about this. And thirdly, wait a second, on top of all of this, you're telling us that we can't engage, or you're not going to lend us the money to invest in emissions heavy industry. That is what would allow us to at least get into middle income status, because you're saying it's going to contribute to climate change. And yet what you're essentially saying is you all should just stay poor, right? So across all of this, you've got a lot of grumpy people on the continent when it comes to climate. And the way that the continent shows up in these conversations is predominantly as a victim. And that's true. Africa is a victim, right? Illustrated very clearly by this picture over here. I love this picture. It makes complete intuitive sense. You've got emissions per capita across the bottom, and you've got GDP per capita going up. And the entire continent of Africa is right over here. You have to delete a lot of the countries because they wouldn't all fit. They're right as close to zero on both of those axes as you can get. And we're breaking the axes in all kinds of ways to show it, right? So very low emissions per capita and very low GDP per capita. The other thing that this picture will tell you, it looks like a random scatter plot at some level until you think about the historical story that it's telling. And the historical story it's telling is we tend simplistically to think of economies as going clockwise on this journey, right? You start off low emissions, low productivity right there. You build productivity and your emissions go up. You can see countries on that journey, China, Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, on that journey. You start to get to higher income and then you start to curve back in two ways. You start to monitor your own emissions and try and think of better ways to do things. But also more cynically, you export all of your heavy emitting industries to other people and you say, well, you Chinese should stop emitting, but thank you very much for the iPhone. We'll take that, thank you. But stop using all that coal. So a lot of countries starting to move across. Some countries should be moving faster than they are, given their relative wealth in terms of reducing their emissions per capita. I'm not pointing any fingers. But that's the journey, right? And it's a pretty maddening one, right? If you consider what we just talked about on the previous slide. And what it also means is when you look at the conversation about climate action, it almost entirely always focuses. If you think about what the big kids table is at COP, it's all about the people on the right. There's some nodding and hand wringing, and we really need to help all the folks down here at the bottom. Send them a few bucks. We promised them 100 billion, which is a fraction of what they need, and we're gonna, bail even on that. And let's have the really serious conversations among us big emitters about who's going to do what, to the extent that some of the countries that are starting to progress into industrialization are emitting a lot. Let's find ways to maybe subsidize their transition to less emitting sources. So the jet Ps for South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia. But in terms of actual dial moving climate action, you don't really talk about the folks in the bottom left because what can they cut, right? Why waste time where there's nothing to cut? Now, that I'm going to say, and of course you can tell from the rhetorical structure of the speech, I'm going to challenge that thinking because I don't think that this number line ends at zero. Let's come back to that. So part of the reason I'm going to challenge it is a couple of the assets that Africa has. This is one of my favorite images. This is solar and wind energy potential as a multiple of national energy demand. It's an image that RMI developed that just I can't get enough of. So gray is replete, so more than 10x. You've got solar and wind resources in a country are more than 10 times current energy demand. Blue is abundant. There's more than 100 times the solar and wind potential in a country as there is current energy demand. And red is super abundant, 1,000x available energy. Basically, my entire home continent has more renewable energy hitting it every year than it would need if it increased its demands by 1,000x. With a few exceptions, South Africa is a few hundred times, and Nigeria, some of the larger economies, that their demand has grown enough. But the underlying point is clear. So 60% of the world's high quality solar potential is in Africa. Now, only 1% of that is developed, or 1% of the world's energy generation capacity. Half of the continent lacks basic access to electricity. And we tell a great story about the surge of investment in renewable energy, places like Texas here in the United States. But Africa received, while sitting on the best renewable energy potential on the planet, 0.6% of global investment flows into renewable energy in 2021. I refer you back to that zip code premium around investment, because the energy return on renewable assets here. Now, there's a whole set of reasons why it's difficult to invest in energy in Africa, but it still remains 0.6%. Hold that in your mind. But lots of potential. The second asset is also a challenge. So you've got the youngest, fastest growing population on the planet, 2.5 billion by 2050. And by then it will be the mainstay of the global workforce. Think of how, if you've been following the news and reading coverage of the global economy over the last year or so, think of the relative ways that people have been talking about India versus China, as China crests officially its demographic bulge and India overtakes it. Africa is going to be to India as India was to China. Secondly, though, this is happening with, there's a lot of migration, there's a lot of climatic stress, right? The entire Sahel is in a state of advanced ecological collapse. That has implications in all directions. There's a whole range of climate wars being fought across the middle of Africa, the migration crisis. As I point out to my European friends, the Mediterranean is neither wide enough nor deep enough a moat to preserve them from the consequences of complete ecological collapse in Africa. It's just not going to work. And then finally, with this rising population, it was very clear 2 or 3 years ago when the list of the world's fastest growing economies was dominated by African countries, is economic growth is happening. It's not happening as fast as it needs to, but it's happening extremely fast in a lot of countries, or was happening extremely fast until the pandemic. And what that means is consumption is rising rapidly. If Africa follows the clockwise pattern, its contribution to global emissions by 2050 would be an additional 12 billion tons a year. So forget even 3 degrees if that happens, right? Remember what we said about the commodity exports. So Africa has a lot of natural resources. And the interesting thing is, very rarely do you have both the previous slide and this slide's stories in the same location. You have very densely populated countries that are largely importers of natural resources. And you have very lightly populated countries. So Japan or China on one end, and then you've got Australia, right? What you don't usually have is Australia's natural resources and India's population coinciding. And that's just because Africa is really big. Right? It's got a big population, but it's also really big. Some of you have seen the map where you actually show, just because of the compression and the way we do our projections, how much of the rest of the world's landmass could fit in here. And in that landmass, you've got a lot of mineral deposits. The thing I always point out is you can bet that Africa's relative share of global reserves of almost every natural resource are massively underestimated, because it's underexplored, and to the extent that it is explored, it's underreported. Lots of folks saying, yeah, you may have a little bit of manganese, you may have a little bit of cobalt. We're not going to tell you exactly how much, because, well, there's an information asymmetry there, right? So all of that is just facts about the continent. But embedded in that is a massive opportunity. If you take those 3 assets, the renewable energy potential, the young workforce, and the natural resources, they open the door to 3 very exciting pathways for economic transformation. The first one is low emission consumption and production, basically leapfrogging past carbon intensive consumption in Africa straight to the new technologies that are starting to, that will be what allow us to maintain decent standards of living everywhere in the world while managing our carbon footprint. Essentially saying that Africa doesn't need to do the equivalent of buying a VCR, then a DVD player before finally getting to streaming. Just go directly there. No one's making DVD players anymore anyway. The second thing is if you do that, and that first one critically depends on going to that 0.6 number and starting to push it up. Increase the amount of energy that's available, amount of renewable energy that's available. It enables a whole bunch of stuff. And I'll share some examples of how some of this works. If you do that, you can do the second thing, which is producing for the world. Essentially cut the global carbon footprint, not just by reducing Africa's own emissions or avoiding Africa emissions, but by saying there's a whole bunch of energy intensive or labor intensive or resource intensive processes that are currently happening in the wrong place on the map. If aliens showed up on planet Earth and showed up at the United Nations and asked, okay, you guys have a climate change problem, let's solve it for you. Or if and well, I should say, when ChatGPT becomes our new AI overlord, it will tell us, step one, stop making stuff in the wrong places, right? Move it to where you have the energy and the labor already co-located to do it efficiently, and the raw materials. And the third pathway is recognizing that we are going to overshoot. I guess that's no longer, no one's arguing moral hazard anymore. It's a given we're going to overshoot. And that means one industry that needs to massively scale all over the planet is carbon dioxide removal. And that's an industry that Africa, as I will point out, is uniquely positioned to play a major role in. So let's take each of those pathways in turn, and I'll just use a few illustrative examples to give you a sense of what this looks like. When you look at, Kenya's NDC, Kenya, my home country, 50 million people, about 110 million tons of emissions under our NDC. The biggest chunk of that comes from cooking fuel, deforestation due to cooking, firewood, charcoal. Lots of people trying to fix that. A lot of it ends up being, subprime carbon projects, essentially dump cook stoves on communities, not sure that they serve consumer demand, claim a low value credit, spend as little as possible actually changing cooking habits, cash your check, buy your house in Mayfair, laugh all the way to the bank. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone in particular. Cocoa Networks, you heard I'm involved in it, so I'll declare my conflict already. I'm an early investor and a board member. But they're interesting. They've gone from a standing start to serving 1 million households in Kenya in the course of 4 years. They're adding households at the rate of 10,000 a week. And the binding constraint is how quickly they can make their ethanol cook stoves. And the reason for that is they've actually built a very sophisticated supply chain with ethanol ATMs in the neighborhoods and informal settlements where people actually live. So you actually don't have to walk very far to buy fuel. The cook stove produces a blue flame that's actually better than gas, as we're finding out, because its only emissions are CO2 and water vapor. And are delivering this at a cost lower, delivering this aspirational good at the price of a charcoal cooker or charcoal burner, and with fuel at the same, at pure cost. And the reason they're able to do this is that they're generating very high integrity, high quality carbon credits that they're able to sell at the top end of the global voluntary and jurisdictional markets. They're selling into the Korean compliance market, for example. Right? That's an example of addressing a particular segment of African consumption, migrating people to a low emission solution in a way that speaks to demand. So this is not about telling people, hey, here's why you should take a hit in your lifestyle to make up for bad choices by the folks driving the Ford 150s. Nothing against them. Maybe a little bit. It's about saying, here is something you want. Here's an aspirational good. We're making it affordable for you by tapping market mechanisms in the right way and allowing it to very quickly displace high emitting technologies. The very same story could be told in areas such as e-mobility, where it's entirely likely that if you look at particularly two-wheelers and mass transport, most African countries import most of their fuel, as Andrew can speak to. It's one of the biggest hits on our foreign exchange bill. Shifting that to that super abundant electricity is a no-brainer if you can get the right kinds of designs of products, the right kinds of financing, and the manufacturing at the right kind of scale. People tend to think that Africa will get to e-mobility years after the rest of the world. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that e-mobility will behave in the very same way as mobile telephony, in that Africa will be a very fast adopter because it works for some of the conditions facing a lot in specific use cases, of course. It's not universal, but it does make a lot of sense. And then in construction, we all know how much of the global emissions bill comes from construction. I like to point out, because of that demographic number, 40% of all new urban construction on planet Earth between now and 2050 is going to be in Africa. When you talk about new materials, when you talk about the future of low carbon construction, you may think you're talking about how they're going to build stuff in Jakarta and Mumbai. You're actually talking about Kinshasa and Dar es Salaam. That's where the battle is going to be fought. The second area is producing for the world. And again, two areas just to illustrate the point. One that's actually pretty obvious is, as we move to a hydrogen economy, if that's going to be part of the solution, Africa, for the obvious sea of red that you saw earlier, is a natural hub for green hydrogen production and export. But more importantly, green hydrogen as the beginning of a pathway, right? So we currently think that the way that the hydrogen economy is going to work is some people are going to make lots and lots of hydrogen, put it on super cool ships, or maybe turn it into ammonia and ship it to other people. But once you have the ammonia, or once you have the hydrogen in a location, we are going to have to rethink almost all our chemical industries. We have built a chemical industrial complex that starts with a complex fossil fuel molecule and breaks it down to create all of the compounds we need for modern life. In all likelihood, over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to have to learn to go the other way, start with the hydrogen and add the carbon using energy to go up. And that becomes really interesting for places that are going to be natural hubs just because of the economic logic for large-scale hydrogen production. Similarly, the raw material point from earlier, 100 million tons of bauxite get shipped from Africa to be refined using bauxite to aluminum is basically electricity. And most of Africa's bauxite is shipped to be refined using coal or other fossil fuels in industrial hubs around the world. Just creating the bankable demand to unlock Africa's renewable energy potential. Because the reason why Africa's renewable energy doesn't get developed is not because there isn't demand. There's lots of poor people who need energy. It's that there isn't bankable demand, right? There isn't anyone that's saying, I'll actually sign on to this. Our governments have limited balance sheets. And yet global demand for this energy is surging, global demand for green energy. So moving use cases such as aluminum processing allows you to develop more energy onto the grid, and also opens pathways to light manufacturing and heavy manufacturing. You've got the aluminum there, you've got the young people there. If you move the metal to Europe, they're just going to move there with it because they're going to need the jobs that it's going to go create. And if you don't want them to move, then keep the jobs there. And then finally, Africa's natural endowments make it a go-to place for all types of carbon removal at scale. We've got, on the nature-based side, the vast forests, mangroves, peatlands that currently store years of global emissions. And we need to rethink the incentives for African countries around managing that. The case in point that I love to point to is Gabon, right? Lots of countries today are selling carbon credits for protecting forests because they have shown that they are actually engaged in large-scale deforestation. Gabon cannot, Gabon is 94% rainforest. And the reason they can't make any money from that is because everyone's like, well, you're not cutting it down anyway. Where's the additionality? I almost feel like I should hire 1,000 lumberjacks with chainsaws to stand next to the trees and start the chainsaws so that Gabon can actually get recognized for being a steward of a good chunk of the world's lungs. Instead, it stays desperately poor. It remains a fossil fuel anchored economy because we prefer to freeload off of their carbon services. So on the nature side, we're going to have to do some rethinking of the incentive structure. There's also an abundant supply of unused agricultural waste that can serve as biomass feedstock for hybrid solutions like biochar. You also have no shortage of both labor and resources to potentially deploy and land, importantly, for solutions such as enhanced weathering. Then we have the right geological formations and also form of fossil fuel reservoirs for direct air capture. And again, there's people in the room who know quite a bit about that. And direct air capture and long-term mineralization. Now, a point I'll make here, and some of you will have heard me make this point in my TED Talk, is at the end of the day, if you're going to do direct air capture, one, I think we can stipulate that direct air capture at scale is probably already locked in as something we're going to have to do. Nature is not going to be able to do as much. Nature and hybrid solutions are not going to be enough to actually do, help us with the amount of overshoot we're going to see. Scaling up direct air capture is problematic because it uses a lot of energy and it has to be green energy. If you scale it up with renewable energy in the global north, then it can only happen after you've used that energy to decarbonize every sector that's currently emitting. Otherwise, you're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back because you're still running the fossil fuel plant next door while you're using your wind turbines to run your DAC. So you can't do it in places that have large decarbonization opportunities in their energy system. And so you're looking for places that have the right geology for sequestration or mineralization, and have massive headroom in terms of renewable energy potential. Sound like any place we've been discussing? Right? And the thing with that is it is another example, if you can get the market incentives right, of the bankable demand that allows you to tap that massive oversupply, that superabundance of renewable energy that's just sitting there waiting for an investment case. So let's come back to our maddening picture and see how it ends up working, right? So take out the countries, you've got the dots, you can kind of remember who's who. Measure number 1, you take all these guys in the bottom here, and if you're limiting the emissions they're adding as they're increasing their prosperity, you're getting them to grow straight up instead of going around the clock, right? Step 2. We're not selfish in Africa. We want to help out our friends and neighbors. So you see that laggard, I won't tell you which country that is, has some production of energy intensive stuff that needs to go someplace where it can be more greenly produced, and not just that country, many others. Shifting it to Africa actually allows the entire global footprint to shift faster than it otherwise would have, in 2 ways, actually. One is for the new production that you shift to Africa, that gets decarbonized immediately. But 2, you introduce a market penalty for having a dirty grid, right? Suddenly countries that were saying, look, if we shut down our emitting power plants, we're going to be less industrially competitive, are saying we have to shut down fast, otherwise we're losing competitiveness to those places that do have green grids. And 3, who said the line stops at 0? Who said the line stops at 0? If we're saying that we have to get to global net zero by 2050, if we're also saying that the industrial engine of the planet, the countries of Asia that are doing most of the world's manufacturing, are not going to get there until 2060 or 2070 by current projections, then if my second grade, no, it wasn't second grade, probably 3rd or 4th grade math teacher's teaching is correct, then the number line still works the way it used to. Somebody's going to have to go net negative big time. And looking at the map so far, I would put it to you that there's really only one candidate, right? But how do we get that to happen? I'd say we need to have a new kind of global grand bargain. We need to rethink how we think about the role of Africa and the developing world in the climate discussion. On the one hand, the rest of the world has to commit to a few things. Right? This is no longer about, hey, you all emitted, please, make it a little bit less painful for the rest of us. Rather, it is the most important thing we need to do globally is cut our global carbon footprint. The most cost-effective ways to do that run straight through large investments in the least invested in place on the planet. What does it mean to make that happen? It means, firstly, that 0.6%. You're going to keep on hearing me talk about it because it's a real pet peeve. Secondly, it's thinking about trade rules, right? You've got the carbon border adjustment coming in Europe. If it's structured in the right way, it accelerates the producing for the world opportunity, because you're basically saying embodied carbon is taxed as it enters into new markets. But the way people are talking about doing it right now is assuming a standard amount of embodied carbon in every import based on how much carbon it takes to do it in Europe. Makes no sense, right? It basically assumes that everyone's starting from the same place, and it doesn't recognize the inherent advantages of some places over others. That has to change. That has to change. We have to be saying we're trying to move production to the places where it makes most climatic sense to do it. And thirdly, it's rethinking our carbon markets. If we are locked into overshoot, if we are going to have to do carbon dioxide removal at scale, then we have to recognize that we're going to need to create carbon markets that work. Right now, they're a nice concept. Sometimes they work, but anyone who's followed the news in the last few months will know there's a lot more hypocrisy and cynicism embedded in the current carbon markets than there is real value. The answer is not toss it out, because we're going to need that mechanism. The answer is make it work. Get to the right prices that actually avoid moral hazard by making it expensive to pay for your carbon sins. Focus on integrity of the credits. Focus on co-benefits. Build market systems that move away from the current system. Today, for every credit, every dollar of credit that's sold from Africa, 20 cents or less gets to the communities that are actually doing the hard work. The rest of it goes into transaction costs, lots of consulting fees and lots of flights of people going back and forth to check whether the mangroves have been planted. It's not rocket science. And even if it were, we do have rocket scientists in Africa, right? So how do we rethink the structure of that market? If you do that, if you make these types of measures, right? If you think about a version of a JETP or whatever succeeds the JETP, that is not just about, well, let's take the worst emitters and maybe help them emit a bit less, but actually saying, how are we investing as a planet and as a species in decarbonizing as fast as possible, as cost effectively as possible? If you do that, then African countries could actually potentially uniquely make a very different kind of climate commitment that's been made today than has been made to date. And that's to say, here's our science-based strategy for climate leadership. Here's how we're going to grow using, tap the carbon markets to grow in a low carbon way. Here are the ways that we're going to play a bigger and bigger role in global trade in sectors that actually allow everyone to benefit in terms of lowering global carbon footprint. And finally, here are the ways in which we can actually deploy our large numbers of potentially idle hands towards the hard work of carbon removal and climate restoration. Oh, and by the way, you add all of that together, we're not saying we're going to get to net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. We're saying 2030, yes, or 2035, net zero. But you know what? By 2050, country X is going to put 5 gigatons back into the global carbon budget if you make a facility available. And that's not charity. Those are investments. They will pay back. Now, that's the kind of climate negotiation that we should be having, that takes the threat seriously, that looks at every country without the biases and histories that we bring to this, and instead says, how do we deploy the planet's resources in the most effective way to address the planet's biggest problem? And we do that, we not only address the planet's problem, but we give the world's youngest continent and a new generation of young people who are currently painted as hapless victims. Nobody likes that. And we tell them, actually, that's not who you are. Your story is not that you missed out on the carbon party, suck it up. Your story is you're the generation whose job will be to save the world. Now, the continent is beginning to recognize this. Leaders are starting to talk about the role of the continent in a slightly different way. President Ruto, the new president of Kenya, announced at COP28 that 27, don't have a time machine just yet, that he saw carbon as one of Kenya's major exports going forward. Now, that requires a whole set of reforms for it to mean something and for it to actually be transformative. That's an interesting aspiration. And he's convening through the African Union in conjunction with a number of African countries, a climate action summit, September 4th to the 6th in Nairobi, to discuss how do developing countries actually contribute to the solution to climate change. It's a climate action summit, not a climate change summit, because climate change summits invariably get captured in woe is us, this is really terrible, really sucks, and it's your fault, which it is, to be clear. But this is about action. This is what we could do if you invested. And I think it's the beginning of exactly that conversation that we need to have, that hopefully continues through COP, through the investment decisions, and through the innovative decisions that people in places like this and around the world make. So with that, I'll pause and turn it back to you for questions.
Questions myself, but let's see if anybody's got anything to say. Yeah, Jason.
Hi, thanks for an amazing talk, very compelling and cogent. The question I have is, your argument, lights, know what you're trying to tell me. Your argument about the natural resources, the human resources, and the energy resources is really compelling in Africa. I just wondering if you could comment on the fact that in addition to all of that, from an investment and development perspective, the fact that Africa sits in the tropics and will also feel some of the largest impacts of climate change with huge implications for infrastructure, public health, ecosystem health, et cetera, creates a peril also in that formula. And I'd just be curious to hear you comment on how to think about that in this investment thesis that you're making.
Completely agreed. And I think my presentation is aimed to be a corrective of the over anchoring in that side of the story. That side of the story is exactly true. I did point that out right at the beginning, that the biggest impacts of climate change are going to be felt on the continent. I think two reflections I'd offer. One is it increasingly makes African countries super motivated to do something about this because they're feeling it. It's not theoretical. And two, a lot of the ideas and opportunities are at least partially resilient to it, right? So you notice I didn't talk about Africa becoming the breadbasket of the world because it's increasingly clear that the effect of climate change on our agricultural potential is going to be substantial. You'll notice also that I don't anchor as much on the role of nature-based carbon sinks in my carbon removal story because we are going to see degradation of Africa's nature-based sinks because of the impacts of climate change. So yes, there are these forces are working in tension with each other. I just think that we've paid so little attention to the opportunity side of this that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there before we get to the balanced story. It's not going to be easy, but I do think that there's a lot of untapped easy potential.
Okay, thank you so much. That was great. Sorry. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, James. That was great. If we take some of these ideas that you're putting forward very seriously, they would entail very sweeping changes in the economic and the political geography of African states, both in terms of how they relate to one another, how they relate to their people, and how they relate to the outside world. Now, we know, of course, from past decades that exactly these questions around economic geography and political geography have also been some of the biggest constraints, as you know, from your work on employment and many other debates in the African context. How would you see kind of more beneficial coalitions emerging from these changing economic and political geographies and the ways they may be sustaining some of the changes you're envisioning rather than holding them back?
Yeah.
Because, of course, everything you're proposing is going to redistribute power economically, politically, socially, and therefore interest will organize around this. Those interests may help this or they may hold it back. So some thoughts on that would be appreciated.
So I do think that regional relationships are important. They're an enabling factor. They're not necessarily in the early going a truly binding constraint. There's a lot of this that can be done at individual nation state level to begin with, but you're right, to get to real scale when you're actually processing the raw materials on continent and so on, you do need things like the Continental Free Trade area to actually start working. Now, I will say the signs are good in that sense. There is a growing recognition of the need for that level of regional integration. There's also, if one is completely honest and also a little bit cynical, a recognition of the fact that previous attempts at integration didn't always necessarily just fall apart of their own accord. There may have been other interests at play in making that a little bit more difficult. And to the extent that those interests are losing a bit of traction on the continent, that's all to the good. I think the third thing I'll say is when you're all exporting raw materials, it's very difficult to see value in each other, right? you begin to see the incentives and the gains from trade and integration once you begin to see economic specialization, the building of specialized capabilities. And the reason why Africa has been particularly so to integrate, I would argue partially, the lack of integration, the lack of collective action is a symptom of this underlying point around being these comprador states that are really feeding the industrial complexes of other parts of the world, and thus are in really zero-sum competition with each other to produce the cheapest cocoa or the cheapest coffee, and not thinking about, well, okay, if I want to lower the cost of my X, I'll need to help you generate more Y. So I think that there's a number of forces, including just the general trend. We're enough past the independence era. There's a whole set of other dynamics. And then this in itself creates incentives. And finally, all of that will take time and be slower than you think. But at the same time, there's enough of this that can happen at individual nation state level. Namibia is already chasing hydrogen hard. Kenya is trying to catch up with them. Other countries, there's stuff on this that can happen at the individual nation state level that then hopefully becomes the impetus for collective action. Not saying any of this is easy. I'm not saying any of this is simple.
So I have a question about how actually to accomplish this.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to say it's possible. It's another thing entirely to actually see it realized, right?
Yeah.
And having literally just come back from Kenya this afternoon, my perspective, and having spent the last 2 weeks talking to farmers in Kenya, there's a very big difference between the people who actually are in the capacity to do things at that lower level and the government top-down approach.
Yeah.
So how do you see the contrast of top-down versus bottom-up in actually achieving some of these climate action goals?
I think a lot of that is where the role of entrepreneurs, both policy entrepreneurs, but then also just actual entrepreneurs and innovators comes in, right? There's a lot of embedded business ideas here, right? Cocoa Networks, a company I talked about, is well on its way to becoming a carbon unicorn, either in its next raise or the one after that. And that has sensitized a lot of people in Nairobi to, hey, this climate thing, people are making real money out of it. Maybe I should think about it in my business model. And the answer to the farmers is not what has typically happened, which is people going to tell farmers, you know, climate change is really important, environment is really important, you really should do the following things. And I expect you to be a more conscientious for the planet farmer than your counterpart who's farming 10,000 hectares in the middle of the Midwest in the United States and who's just focused on their bottom line. No, it has to be about the bottom line. It has to be, here's your solar irrigation pump. It's cheaper and works better than your alternative, which is either praying for rain or buying diesel to run a solar pump. Oh, and by the way, part of the reason it's so cheap is that it's subsidized by carbon. You don't need to understand that, right? It's just a cheaper solution to what you're doing today, right? That's not going to happen because of government policy. It's going to happen because sun culture is delivering solar irrigation pumps, right? The biodigesters aren't going to be deployed by government policy. They're going to be deployed because Sistema Bio actually gets their product out and actually gets it to a price point. And look at area after area where, you know, my new job, which wasn't mentioned earlier, is I run a venture studio, Africa Climate Ventures. And this is exactly what we're after, is what are those areas where there's just an untapped opportunity to do this at tremendous scale. And we'll make 20 bets ourselves and, you know, maybe 3 or 4 pan out. And if 20 other people do the same thing, maybe we get somewhere.
Great, thank you. I have, I guess, a similar sort of maybe practicality question. The state of the workforce that we're talking about that can be sort of deployed or leveraged for this proposal, what do you see as like the mechanism for workforce development, education, the status of institutions like universities in helping to train that workforce and be ready to take advantage of opportunities? And just thinking about, you know, schools like Columbia and schools across Africa and like the role in which we play in helping to support that. Just would love to hear your thoughts.
So that's a big chunk of this, is actually helping young people understand what are the new areas of opportunity. So one of the things that we are thinking about at CAPE is how do you actually draw a map of where is the biggest imbalance between current balance of skills? And it's actually not the higher education side of this that worries me the most. There's a lot of, look around, there's a lot of Africans around here, right? And a lot of Africans who are well trained in a range of technical subjects on the continent. There actually are more of them than there are jobs to absorb them, which is why you have engineer taxi driver. Well, they're not taxi drivers, they're out looking for work because there's not enough money for taxi drivers. So that's not my big worry. My big worry is your vocational trades, right? So right now, the continent is hurting for solar installers, and yet there are vacancies in solar panel installation courses at technical colleges because people are going to other courses. Claire here will tell you that there's no shortage of people with advanced degrees in the fields related to the geothermal sector in a country like Kenya. There's lots of those people. They know what they're doing. They don't know that in addition to working for the power utility, they could be working on really innovative carbon mineralization solutions. So some of that is understanding, hey, this is a good, exciting new field that you could get into. And then trusting that if you create the demand in a place where there's an abundance of untapped or undirected supply, it will create motivation and direction, but then a lot of investments need to then be made to create the training materials and so on. What I've noted is there's a lot of work being done to train people in Africa, but too much of it is supply oriented. Let's just increase people's skills. And everything I've seen about how youth employment works is it has to be demand driven first. Show me an industry that doesn't have enough people, and I will create technical training modules that deliver those people within a certain number of years. Tell me to train 1,000 people in something and maybe an industry will form. You just created 1,000 really annoyed, unemployed people.
So, okay, one last question. I was going to ask
So I have also a practicality question, just having myself arrived from East Africa. I see that like $100 a ton or 100 euros a ton prices in Europe. A lot can happen. All the systemas and the sun cultures and everything will thrive. But the price in Sub-Saharan Africa right now, East Africa, is below $5. Why is, when will this convergence occur? What is driving these differences?
So there's a couple of things. It speaks directly to my point about the structure and nature and the embedded injustices of the global carbon markets. So actually, I shook my head a little bit because there are people in Africa realizing $20 a ton or more, right? For high integrity, high quality traditional credits. And there's no reason why once you move to the high durability end of the scale, you shouldn't realize the same, at least at this stage now, the stimulative $500 to $1,000 a ton for really permanent removals, right? There's no reason why it's permanent removal, right? You just need to build that capability. Now that number, that price point is going to come down probably towards the social cost of carbon, which is somewhere between $100 and $200 a ton. As the industry scale and there's a cost competitiveness there. I think there's work to be done around, for example, getting rid of subprime carbon, getting rid of the, I draw a line around a space in the map and I say, I'm going to train the people there in how to live in harmony with nature. They've been living in harmony with nature since before you got there. You hand out a few t-shirts, take a picture of some beehives, maybe some women weaving baskets and say, behold, I have saved this natural ecosystem. Give me my $5 a ton, right? And I don't care whether it's 5 or 6 or 7. I don't really care because I did virtually nothing and it's all upside, right? We need to move from that to saying, show me the actual benefit, right? Let's just get rid of this subprime $5, $10 crap and move at least to the $20 level where actually you start to unleash a whole lot of economic opportunity. And then from there, you can grow.
Well, someone's alarm just told us we've finished. Seriously, this has been a wonderful occasion. Great to have you here. I'd like to welcome everybody to stay behind. There's drinks, food, and everything. We can hang and talk to James some more about his amazing work. But I'd just like to finish by thanking you so much for this talk. It was just amazing. Look forward to further involvement with you in the climate school. So thank you very much.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Great, thanks.